Nurse stopped the surgery seconds before it started. Elena Hayes had trusted the scans until she didn't. In the white glare of Operating Room 7, with Lucas Devereaux already unconscious and the scalpel poised above his skin, she saw what everyone else had missed. The tumor was wrong. The location was wrong. Everything was catastrophically, irrevocably wrong. Her throat closed around a scream that could end her career or save a life. The fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent song as time fractured into before and after. What she carried from childhood, silent, buried, unspoken, rose like a tide to drown her or make her whole. Subscribe to witness the moment one voice shattered the machinery of death. The operating room existed in a state of manufactured serenity, a temple of precision where every surface gleamed with antiseptic promise and every instrument lay arranged in perfect geometry. Elena Hayes stood at her station, her 32 years of life compressed into this singular moment of professional poise. Her scrubs the color of surgical green that had long ago ceased to register as a color at all. The fluorescent lights overhead cast no shadows, only an even, relentless illumination that turned human skin into something waxy and unreal, as if they were all players in a carefully choreographed performance rather than living beings about to alter the course of another's existence. Her hands, gloved in latex that whispered with each movement, rested at her sides with the stillness that came from years of training, though beneath that stillness her pulse kept its own rhythm, steady but insistent, a drumbeat only she could hear. The air conditioning hummed its monotonous lullaby, maintaining the room at exactly 68 degrees, the temperature at which human flesh neither sweated nor shivered, at which bodies could be opened and repaired without the complications of biological distress. Lucas Devereaux lay on the operating table like a sacrifice offered to the gods of modern medicine, his 25-year-old body already surrendered to the chemical embrace of anesthesia, his chest rising and falling with mechanical regularity under the watchful eye of monitors that translated life into green lines and steady beeps. His face, slack in unconsciousness, held the ghostly beauty of the very wealthy, that particular refinement of features that came from generations of good nutrition and better breeding, though now it was rendered vulnerable. Stripped of the arrogance that money usually provided as armor, Elena had seen his file, knew the weight of the name Devereaux, understood that this was not merely a patient, but a constellation of expectations, a young man whose continued existence mattered to boards of directors and trust funds and society pages. The surgical drapes had been arranged around him with meticulous care, creating a sterile field that transformed him from person to procedure, from Lucas to the site of intervention, though his dark hair, visible above the blue fabric, remained stubbornly human, a reminder that beneath the clinical abstractions lived someone's son. The monitors continued their reassuring chorus, each number within acceptable parameters, each waveform tracing the predictable patterns of a body held in the suspended animation between life and the work of healing. Dr. Marcus Westfield stood opposite Elena, his 48 years of surgical experience evident in the casual confidence of his posture, the way his eyes moved across the prepared field with the assurance of a man who had performed this exact procedure hundreds of times before. He was speaking in low tones to Dr. Sarah Chen, the anesthesiologist. Their conversation, the mundane exchange of professionals who had worked together so often that words became merely punctuation in a shared understanding. The surgical residents flanked the table like acolytes, their young faces tense with the concentration of those still learning that medicine was equal parts science and theater, that confidence must be performed even when doubt whispered its corrosive questions. Elena watched them all with the detached awareness that came from occupying a particular position in the medical hierarchy, essential but invisible, responsible but rarely acknowledged, the nurse who ensured that the machinery of surgery functioned smoothly while remaining perpetually in the background of the surgical narrative. She had learned long ago not to resent this invisibility, had accepted it as the price of her profession, though sometimes, in moments like these, she felt the weight of all she witnessed and said nothing about, all the small compromises that accumulated into a career. The scans hung on the lightboard like secular icons, the MRI and CT images displaying Lucas Devereux's skull in cross-section, the tumor visible as a darker mass against the grey architecture of his brain. Elena had reviewed them during the preoperative briefing, had listened as Dr. Westfield traced the planned incision with his finger, explaining the approach they would take to remove the growth that threatened the young man's life. The images had seemed clear then, unambiguous in their message. The tumor located precisely where the radiologist's report indicated, where the surgical plan assumed it would be. Now, in the suspended time before the first cut, Elena found her eyes drawn back to those images, scanning them with an attention that went beyond professional duty into something more instinctive, more urgent. There was something about the shadows, the way the contrast distributed itself across the scan, that nagged at her consciousness like a splinter beneath skin, too small to see but impossible to ignore. She told herself it was nothing, that her role was not to second-guess the diagnostic team, that Dr. Westfield had reviewed these images with specialists and reached consensus about the surgical approach. Yet the unease persisted, growing with each breath she took of the sterile, recycled air. The surgical team moved through their final preparations with the ritualized precision of a ceremony performed countless times, each member executing their assigned role in the choreography of intervention. The scrub nurse counted instruments with whispered efficiency, her voice a metronome marking the seconds before commencement. The surgical technician adjusted the overhead lights, angling them to eliminate every possible shadow from the field where Dr. Westfield's hands would soon work their calculated violence in service of healing. Elena felt the familiar tightening in her chest that always came in these moments, the awareness that they stood on the threshold of irreversibility, that once the scalpel broke skin, they entered a territory where retreat was impossible and only forward momentum existed. She had felt this sensation hundreds of times, in hundreds of surgeries, but it never diminished, never became routine, because each time involved a unique and irreplaceable human life suspended in the balance of their collective competence. Lucas Devereux's monitors continued their steady music, oblivious to the tension that had begun to crystallize in Elena's awareness, a tension she could not yet name but could no longer ignore. The clock on the wall marked each second with a barely audible click, time moving forward with indifferent persistence toward the moment when everything would begin. Eleanor's eyes moved between the scans and the draped figure on the table, her mind working through the geometry of the images, comparing them to the three-dimensional reality of the patient's head resting in the surgical cradle. Something was wrong. The certainty came not from conscious analysis, but from somewhere deeper, more primitive, the way an animal knows a storm is coming before any visible signs appear. She could feel her heart rate accelerating, feel the slight dampness forming beneath her gloves. Despite the room's controlled temperature, feel the weight of protocol and hierarchy pressing against her growing conviction that they were about to make a catastrophic error. Dr. Westfield was reaching for the marker that would trace the incision line on Lucas Devereux's shaved scalp, his movements unhurried and assured, a master craftsman about to begin a familiar work. The moment was arriving, the point of no return approaching, with the inexorability of a train already in motion, and Elena stood frozen between her training, which told her to trust the system, to remain silent unless directly addressed, and an instinct that screamed at her to stop everything, to look again, to question what everyone else had already accepted as truth. Elena's eyes snapped back to the scans with an urgency that bordered on violence, her vision tunneling until nothing existed except those grey and white images hanging in their luminous frames. The tumour sat there in the imaging, a darker mass, approximately 3 centimetres in diameter, its edges slightly irregular in the way of malignant growths, positioned in what the radiology report had identified as the right temporal lobe, accessible through a standard craniotomy approach that Dr. Westfield had performed with textbook precision dozens of times. But now, with her heart hammering against her ribs and her breath coming shorter, Eleanor saw something else. Or rather, she saw the absence of something, a discrepancy so subtle that it lived in the realm of shadows and angles, in the negative space between what the image showed and what the reality of Lucas Devereux's actual skull must contain. The scan had been taken 3 days ago, standard protocol for pre-surgical planning, but Elena suddenly understood with terrible clarity that 3 days was an eternity in the life of aggressive tumours, and that the confident assumptions everyone had made about the mass's location might have become fatally outdated. She could feel the knowledge rising in her throat like bile, acidic and undeniable, the certainty that if they proceeded with the planned incision, they would be cutting into healthy tissue, while the actual tumour, shifted and growing, destroyed irreplaceable structures elsewhere in Lucas Devereux's brain. The operating room continued its preparations around her, oblivious to the crisis crystallizing in Elena's consciousness. The team moving through their checklist with the smooth efficiency of people who believed they knew exactly what they were doing. Dr. Westfield had begun marking the incision site with his purple surgical marker, drawing a careful line across Lucas Devereux's scalp, his movements steady and precise, each stroke bringing them closer to irreversible action. Elena watched his hand trace the arc of the planned cut and felt time becoming elastic, stretching and compressing simultaneously, each second containing both an eternity of possibility and no time at all to prevent disaster. She could see Dr. Chen adjusting her anesthesia monitors, ensuring that Lucas remained in the perfect state of unconscious stasis. His brain activity dampened to just the levels necessary to maintain life, while preventing any awareness of the violation about to be performed upon his body. The surgical residents leaned forward slightly, their attention focused on Dr. Westfield's marking technique, learning from the master how to translate imaging into incision, how to bridge the gap between abstract representation and concrete flesh. No one was looking at Elena, no one registered the tremor that had begun in her hands, or the way her breathing had become shallow and rapid, because nurses were not supposed to experience crisis, were trained to be the stable, invisible support system upon which the drama of surgery unfolded. Elena's mind raced through the protocols that governed her role, the chain of command that dictated she should speak only when spoken to, should defer to the superior knowledge of the physicians, should trust that the diagnostic team and the surgical team and all the other teams had done their jobs with the same competence she brought to hers. She thought of the 1,000 ways this moment could go wrong if she spoke up, the embarrassment if she was mistaken, the professional consequences of challenging a surgeon of Dr. Westfield's reputation in front of residents and staff, the way her voice would sound in this sterile sanctuary, shrill and panicked, the voice of a woman who had overstepped her position, the weight of institutional hierarchy pressed down on her like a physical force, reminding her of every time she had witnessed nurses punished for speaking out of turn, for questioning decisions made by those with more letters after their names. But beneath that weight, deeper than training or fear of consequences, something else stirred in Elena's chest, a memory she had buried so deeply that it had become part of her skeleton, a childhood trauma that had shaped every choice she'd made since, that had driven her into nursing in the first place, and that now demanded she break her silence or live with another death she might have prevented. The scans blurred slightly as tears of frustration and terror gathered in her eyes, and she blinked them away viciously, refusing to let emotion cloud the terrible clarity that had seized her. She looked at Lucas Devereux's face again, that vulnerable mask of unconsciousness, and saw not a billionaire's son, but simply a young man who had trusted them with his life, who had no idea that the very team assembled to save him might be about to kill him, through a combination of outdated imaging and overconfidence. His eyelids were taped shut to protect the corneas during surgery, giving him the appearance of a sleeping child, peaceful and trusting in the hands of adults who supposedly knew better. Elena thought about his mother, whoever she was, probably sitting in some private waiting room with coffee growing cold in expensive cups, believing that her son was receiving the best care money could buy, never imagining that at this very moment a nurse was standing frozen with knowledge that could save or destroy everything. The monitors continued their serene beeping, each tone a reassurance that all systems were normal, that the body on the table remained stable and ready for the intervention that everyone but Eleanor still believed was correctly planned. Time was running out, measured in the final preparations being completed, in the way Dr. Westfield was now stepping back to examine his marking, nodding with satisfaction at the line he'd drawn, preparing to reach for the scalpel that would transform intention into irreversible action. Elena's training warred with her instinct, her professionalism with her intuition, her fear of consequence with her moral certainty that remaining silent would make her complicit in a preventable tragedy. She thought of all the surgeries she had witnessed, all the times she had stood in exactly this position and watched the ballet of intervention unfold according to plan, trusting that the system worked, that the checks and balances built into medical practice would catch errors before they became catastrophes. But she also knew, with the hard-won wisdom of years in hospitals, that systems failed precisely because everyone assumed someone else had caught the error, that catastrophes happened in the space between professional silos, that people died not because of individual incompetence, but because of collective failures to communicate, to double-check, to question the consensus. The scans hung there like an accusation, their grey shadows suddenly seeming less like definitive maps and more like crude approximations, insufficient foundations upon which to base decisions about cutting into a human brain. She could see the tumor in the image, but she could also see, or thought she could see, or needed to believe she could see, the ways in which that image might be lying, might be showing them what had been true 3 days ago rather than what was true now, in this operating room, in this moment that would define whether Lucas Devereux walked out of here whole or left in pieces. The childhood memory that Elena had spent decades trying to forget surged forward with unexpected force, breaking through the walls she'd constructed around it. Her father in the hospital bed, the doctors so confident in their diagnosis, her mother's voice asking questions that were dismissed with patronizing patience, the way everyone had trusted the system right up until the moment it killed him. She had been 7 years old, small enough to hide behind her mother's legs, old enough to understand that the adults were wrong but too young to know how to make them listen. She remembered the funeral, remembered standing beside a grave while people murmured about tragic mistakes and rare complications, remembered swearing to herself with a child's absolute conviction that she would never be the silent witness to another preventable death. That promise had driven her through nursing school, through late shifts and difficult patients, through every moment when she'd been tempted to choose the easier path of deference and compliance. Now, 3 decades later, that promise rose like a ghost, demanding she fulfill the vow she'd made at her father's graveside, demanding she find her voice in this room, where voices like hers were not supposed to speak, demanding she choose between the comfort of silence and the terror of consequence. The word erupted from Elena's throat like a physical thing, shattering the sterile calm of the operating room with the force of a gunshot. Stop! her voice raw and commanding in a way she had never heard herself speak before, had never known herself capable of producing. The syllable hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled, freezing every person in the room mid-motion, transforming the scene into a tableau of suspended action. Dr. Westfield's hand halted with the scalpel blade hovering millimeters above Lucas Devereux's marked skin, his eyes snapping up to locate the source of this unprecedented interruption, his expression moving through surprise toward something darker, more dangerous. The residents went rigid, their training screaming that protocol had just been violated in the most egregious way possible, that the sacred hierarchy of the operating room had been shattered by a nurse who had forgotten her place. Dr. Chen's fingers paused on her equipment, her attention dividing between her monitors and the sudden tension that had electrified the space. Elena felt every eye in the room turn toward her, felt the weight of their collective shock and disapproval crash over her like a wave. But she could not stop now, could not retreat back into silence, because she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The tumor, Elena heard herself saying, her voice steadier now despite the adrenaline flooding her system, despite the way her hands shook as she moved toward the light board where the scans hung in their false authority. The location is wrong. These images are 3 days old, and the tumor has shifted. She could hear the tremor beneath her words, the fear and certainty braided together, but she pushed forward, pointing at the scans with a finger that remained surprisingly steady, given the earthquake happening inside her chest. Look at the contrast pattern here, the way the mass sits against the temporal bone. It doesn't match the marker placement. If you cut where you've marked, you'll be going through healthy tissue, while the actual tumor is here, posterior and inferior to where you think it is. The words spilled out of her in a rush, technical language mixed with desperate conviction. Her entire career suddenly balanced on whether she could make them see what she saw, whether she could translate her certainty into something that would penetrate their assumption that she was wrong, that she was overstepping, that she was a nurse playing at being a radiologist or a neurosurgeon. Dr. Westfield straightened to his full height, the scalpel still in his hand, his jaw tight with the kind of anger that came from being questioned in front of subordinates. But Elena forced herself to meet his eyes, to hold his gaze even as she felt herself shrinking inside, even as every instinct screamed at her to apologize and retreat. "Nurse Hayes," Dr. Westfield said, his voice carrying the lethal calm of controlled fury, each word precisely enunciated like scalpel cuts. "These scans have been reviewed by radiology, by neurology, by the tumor board. The surgical plan has been approved through every appropriate channel. Your concerns are noted, but this is not your area of expertise." He began to turn back toward Lucas Devereux, dismissing her with the finality of someone who had dealt with hundreds of nervous nurses and had no time for their unfounded anxieties. But Eleanor found herself moving forward, positioning herself between the surgeon and the patient, a physical barrier that made the confrontation impossible to ignore, that transformed her interruption from verbal protest to bodily resistance. She could feel her heart hammering so hard she thought it might bruise her ribs from the inside, could feel sweat breaking out across her back despite the room's careful temperature control, could feel the career she had built over 12 years beginning to crack beneath her feet like ice over deep water. "Please," she said, and hated the pleading tone that crept into her voice. Hated that she had to beg for them to consider the possibility that they might be wrong. "Just look again. Order a new scan. Even if I'm mistaken, what harm is there in confirming? But if I'm right, and we proceed—" She let the sentence hang, let them imagine what she was imagining. The scalpel cutting through healthy brain tissue, the tumor left untouched and growing. Lucas Devereux waking to deficits that would define the rest of his shortened life, or not waking at all. The operating room had become a battlefield, invisible lines drawn between those who believed in the established order and the single voice challenging it, between protocol and instinct, between hierarchy and moral imperative. The residents looked between Eleanor and Dr. Westfield like children watching their parents fight, uncertain which authority to support, their training telling them to side with the surgeon, but something in Elena's desperate certainty giving them pause. Dr. Chen had moved closer to the scans, her eyes narrowing as she examined them with fresh attention, the only person in the room who seemed willing to consider that the nurse might not be completely insane. Elena could see the calculation happening behind Dr. Westfield's eyes, the weighing of his reputation against the risk of proceeding, the fury at being challenged against the terrible possibility that she might be right. "You're out of line," he said finally. But the certainty had leaked from his voice, replaced by something harder to read, something that might have been the first crack of doubt. "But you've made it impossible to proceed without addressing your concerns. If this delays the surgery unnecessarily, if this causes complications from extended anesthesia, that's on you." He nodded curtly to one of the residents. "Get radiology up here for an immediate scan. We'll verify the tumor location before proceeding." The words should have been a victory, but they tasted like ashes in Elena's mouth, because she understood that she had just ended her career as she knew it, that regardless of whether she was right or wrong, she had committed the unforgivable sin of making a surgeon look uncertain in front of his team. Lucas Devereux lay oblivious to the drama unfolding around his unconscious body, his monitors continuing their steady chorus, his chest rising and falling with mechanical regularity, while the adults argued over how best to cut him open. Elena looked at his face and felt a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly buckled her knees. Fear and relief and residual terror and a strange, fierce protectiveness toward this young man she had never met before today, whose life had somehow become the vessel for all her unresolved grief and guilt. She thought of her father again, of the way he had trusted his doctors right up until the end, of the promises she had made standing beside his grave, and understood that this moment had been inevitable from that day forward, that every choice she'd made had been leading her toward this confrontation between silence and voice. The surgical team began the work of preparing for the emergency scan, their movements stiff with resentment and confusion, the rhythm of the surgery disrupted in a way that would ripple through the rest of the day. Dr. Westfield stood apart, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable behind his surgical mask, but Eleanor could feel the rage emanating from him like heat from a furnace. She had won the battle, but understood intuitively that the war was just beginning, that the institutional machinery would grind her up for this transgression, that speaking truth in a place built on hierarchy carried consequences that would follow her long after this moment passed into memory. The portable imaging equipment arrived with surprising speed, wheeled into the operating room by technicians who looked bewildered at being summoned for an emergency scan on a patient already prepped for surgery. They worked with efficient speed, positioning the machine, adjusting Lucas Devereux's head to capture the angles they needed, the mechanical whir and click of the technology filling the tense silence that had settled over the room like fog. Elena stood against the wall now, as far from the action as the small space allowed, her arms wrapped around herself as if to hold her body together through force of will. She watched the scan progress and felt time becoming strange again, each second both infinite and instantaneous, the wait for confirmation or refutation of her concerns, stretching into something almost unbearable. "Doctor." Chen had moved to stand beside her, and Eleanor felt the anesthesiologist's presence as a small comfort, a suggestion that she was not completely alone in her rebellion against the established order. "You have courage," Dr. Chen said quietly. her voice pitched low enough that only Elena could hear. "Or you're about to have a very short career, possibly both." Elena managed a shaky smile beneath her mask, appreciated the gallows humor, understood that in this moment she had become either a hero or a cautionary tale, and that the next few minutes would determine which narrative would define her. The new scans appeared on the monitors, with the slow inevitability of judgment being rendered, the images loading line by line across the screens, while every person in the operating room held their breath in the space between vindication and humiliation. Elena watched the pictures resolve into clarity and felt her vision blur with tears she could not afford to shed, because there it was, the tumor, visible and undeniable, positioned exactly where she had said it would be, shifted nearly 2 centimeters posterior and inferior to where the original scans had shown it, growing with aggressive speed into territory that would have been untouched by Dr. Westfield's planned incision. The silence that filled the room was different now, no longer the shocked stillness of interrupted protocol, but the awful hush of people confronting their own fallibility, of professionals realizing how close they had come to a catastrophic error, of a team understanding that a nurse they had been prepared to dismiss had just saved them from a mistake that would have ended careers and destroyed a life. Dr. Westfield stood motionless before the screens, his posture rigid, his eyes moving between the old scans and the new ones, tracing the migration of the mass that should not have moved so dramatically but had, that should have been caught by the standard protocols but wasn't. That would have killed Lucas Devereux if Elena Hayes had remained silent in her assigned role. The surgeon's voice, when he finally spoke, was stripped of its earlier anger, replaced by something flatter and more exhausted, the tone of someone who had just glimpsed how fragile the foundations of his expertise really were. "You were right," he said, and the 3 words seemed to cost him something essential, seemed to age him in the space between syllables. "The tumor has shifted significantly. The original surgical plan would have been—" He trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the sentence, to speak aloud the word catastrophic or fatal, or any of the other terms that accurately described what they had been seconds away from doing. He turned to face Elena, and she saw in his eyes not the fury she had expected, but something more complex. Gratitude mixed with resentment, relief tangled with humiliation, and beneath it all, a flicker of something that might have been respect or might have been rage, at having to feel respect for someone he had been prepared to discipline. "Thank you, Nurse Hayes," he said formally. The words correct but strained, the mandatory acknowledgement of a debt he clearly wished he did not owe. "Your vigilance prevented a serious error. We'll need to reconvene to plan a new surgical approach based on these updated images." The residents were staring at Elena now with expressions that mixed awe and confusion, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken with wisdom beyond their own, as if the natural order had inverted and they were no longer certain which way was up. Elena felt the adrenaline beginning to ebb from her system, leaving behind a trembling weakness that threatened to drop her to the floor if she released her rigid posture even slightly. She nodded in response to Dr. Westfield's thanks, unable to trust her voice, understanding that her vindication was real but that the cost would still be extracted, that institutions did not forgive those who revealed their vulnerabilities, even when those revelations saved lives. The surgical team began the process of bringing Lucas Devereux out of anesthesia safely, since the operation would need to be postponed while they developed a new approach, while they accounted for the tumor's aggressive growth and planned an incision that would actually accomplish what they had promised his family. The young man would wake confused and frightened, would have to face the knowledge that his surgery had been stopped at the last moment, but he would wake. And that fact suddenly seemed to Elena like a miracle too large to contain in her exhausted body. She thought of all the patients who had not woken, of all the errors that went unchallenged, of all the voices that remained silent because speaking felt too dangerous or too futile. She thought of her father, and for the first time in 25 years felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of guilt and grief that had defined her since childhood beginning to unwind. "Doctor," Jen approached as the rest of the team worked to reverse the anesthesia, her eyes warm above her mask, her hand finding Elena's shoulder with gentle pressure. "That took incredible courage," the anesthesiologist said softly. "And now you need to tell me how you knew, how you saw what the radiologists missed, what the tumor board didn't catch, what all of us were too confident to question." Elena felt the question pierce through the professional facade she had maintained, felt it reach toward the place where her secret lived, the trauma she had carried unspoken through her entire career. The words began spilling out before she could stop them, before she could calculate whether revealing this piece of herself was wise or professional or appropriate. "My father," she said, and her voice cracked on the word, broke open like a wound that had never properly healed. "When I was 7, brain tumor. They missed it on the first scan, said he had migraines, gave him medication that didn't help. By the time they realized their mistake, it had grown too large to operate safely. He died 3 weeks after the correct diagnosis." The confession hung between them, raw and painful. The secret foundation upon which Elena's entire career had been built, the ghost that had driven her to nursing and made her vigilant to the point of obsession, that had trained her eyes to see what others missed because she could not bear to witness another preventable death. "I became a nurse because of him," Elena continued, the words flowing now like a river through a broken dam, unstoppable and cleansing, "because I watched my mother ask questions that the doctors dismissed, watched her instincts get overruled by their expertise, watched her be right when it was too late to matter. I swore I would never be silent the way she was forced to be silent, never defer to authority when I knew something was wrong, never let hierarchy matter more than life." She looked at Lucas Devereux's face, saw him beginning to stir as the anesthesia lifted, saw his eyelids flutter with the first hints of returning consciousness. "When I looked at those scans, I saw my father's tumor, saw the way it had grown between images, saw all the confidence that killed him reflected in this room. I couldn't let it happen again. I couldn't stand there and watch another family lose someone because we were too proud or too sure to question our assumptions." The confession left her feeling simultaneously lighter and more vulnerable, as if she had removed armor that had also been holding her together, as if speaking the truth might heal her or destroy her, but could not leave her unchanged. The operating room had become a confessional, the sterile space transformed by Elena's revelation into something more human and fragile. A place where mistakes were possible and courage was necessary, and the machinery of medicine revealed itself as fallible as the people operating it. Dr. Westfield, who had moved to the side of the room during the emergence from anesthesia, looked at Elena with an expression she could not quite read, some combination of understanding and discomfort at having his own near catastrophe linked to her family tragedy. The residents were silent, absorbing lessons about hubris and vigilance that no lecture could have taught them as effectively as witnessing this crisis and its resolution. Lucas Devereux's eyes opened fully, confusion flooding his features as he tried to understand why he was waking in an operating room where surgery had not yet begun, why all these people were standing around him with expressions of relief and exhaustion. Elena moved to his side instinctively, her training reasserting itself, her hand finding his with gentle pressure. "You're safe," she told him, her voice steady now, professional but warm. "There was a complication with the imaging, but we caught it in time. You're going to be fine." She didn't tell him that he had been seconds from a catastrophic error, didn't burden him with the knowledge of how close he had come to never waking up whole or waking up at all. But she held his hand and felt the pulse of his life beneath her fingers, and knew that this moment would define her for whatever remained of her career. As Lucas Devereux was wheeled from the operating room toward recovery, as the team dispersed with hushed conversations and sideways glances at Elena, as the machinery of the hospital continued its relentless rhythm around the disruption she had caused, Elena finally allowed herself to lean against the wall and close her eyes. The trauma she had carried since childhood felt different now, not erased, because grief did not work that way, but transformed from burden into purpose, from wound into wisdom. She thought of her father and imagined him seeing what she had done, imagined him proud of the woman who had found her voice when silence would have been easier, who had honored his memory by refusing to let history repeat itself. The weight of consequence still awaited her, the meetings with administration, the potential reprimands, the way her relationship with Dr. Westfield and the surgical team would be forever altered by this confrontation. But in this moment, alone in the empty operating room with its bloodless battlefield, Elena Hayes felt something she had not experienced since she was 7 years old, standing beside a grave. She felt like she had kept a promise that mattered, like she had transformed her trauma into protection for someone else, like the secret she had carried had finally been unveiled not as shame, but as the source of a courage that saved a life. The fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent song above her, but Eleanor stood beneath them as someone changed, someone who had learned that speaking truth in systems designed to silence it was both terrifying and necessary, and that sometimes the only way to heal old wounds was to refuse to let them be inflicted on anyone else.